Hello and welcome to the first of the Developer Toolkit videos. So in these toolkit videos, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be taking a look at specific types of systems and things like that we might be wanting to build in our games, and then I'm going to focus on building that. So I'll be putting together the code for those. As with all of the other videos, the full code for those is going to be available up on GitHub, and that code, you're able to use any of the code that I create in these videos for any of your own projects, whether they are commercial or non-commercial. And if you're finding these videos helpful, then please chuck in a like or a subscribe. It really does help out with the channel. And so let's dive into this first one, where we're going to be taking a look at setting up a system for buffs and cursors. So what I've got here set up already is this is a cut down version of my template project. So that template project is fully available. So in terms of what this gives us to start off with, is we have set up here where we've got a custom character controller. We have a bunch of test slopes that we can be moving along, including the good old stairs, which are always a horrendous thing to try and make work. And we've got these different test slopes, so we can see the behavior along these. And the character can jump and fall. So what we want to do is we want to set up a system with this for buffs and cursors. And really, it's a general system for being able to apply effects. So there's a couple of components we want to have to this. So one of the key parts is this idea of an infrastructure that allows something to be affected, and that we can add effects to that, and that we can query what effects are applied. And we also then need the side of things where we can actually pick up and apply those particular effects. So for this one, I'm going to make it that the effects get applied by running into them. But the key focus here is I want to set up a generalized system for being able to apply effects and being able to work with them. So whenever I'm setting up systems for a project, I like to keep them organized. So I usually will have a dedicated sort of systems folder. And then under that, each system gets its own particular one. So in this case, I'm going to call this my status effect system. And then within that, I will actually have stuff, it's not scripts to begin with, I want a scripts folder. So with our status effects, we know if we think about a couple of things that we need. So we obviously need the effect that's able to be picked up. So the actual item that can be picked up. But then we have separate to that, the actual effect itself. Now we're going to have a lot of different types of effects, and we're also going to need some way of being able to have something be affectable. So in this case, the effects will apply to the player character, but we want it to be a fairly generic system so that any sort of item in the world could actually have effects applied to it. So trying to make it a bit more of a generalized system. So in theory, we could do things like, well, maybe we've got a burning effect and we could apply that to a door, for example, to have the door eventually be destroyed. So having this as a more generalized thing, I think will work well for us. So I'm going to set up a couple of things here. So to begin with, I'm going to have a base effect. So the effects, I want them to inherit from a common class, just so that there is a common sort of interface there that I can be having them work with. Now with this, I then am going to set up a affectable object. So the idea being that something like our player character can be an affectable object. So it is able to be affected by these particular things. So I'm going to set that up on here. And so what I'm going to do with this, because I have a rough idea of, okay, well, my character is able to move around already. And so what could be a really useful thing there is being able to apply different effects that might change how we're able to be moving, for example. That might change our jump height or our speed, or things that if we want to be a little bit sort of meaner to the player and having some curse options, things that go in reverse or may add some chaos to the player's controls. So that's what we're going to do. So I like with these systems thinking about how am I going to use them first. So that's often my starting point. How do I want to use this? And then I would look at sort of setting up things in relation to that. So what I'm going to do is, because I know I will have that affectable object script on this. So affectable. And then what I want to do is that's something where, and I don't think I already have an awake in this. Just want to check. Nope, I don't. So I'm going to add in an awake. And that is where I'm going to retrieve my affectable. I'll retrieve that to begin with. And so that allows it to be affected. So if we think about the different things that I want to be able to mess with. So definitely one of the things was the jump height. So each of these is going to be fairly different in terms of how it gets applied. But if we take a look for where jumping happens, so jumping gets requested. And so we check if the jump is requested, then it goes through a couple of checks to make sure it definitely can. And then we have the actual bit where it gets applied here. So this is where we apply the jump height, and we've also got this jump velocity here, which is used to move the character up. So we have this maximum height that they will go to, and then we also have the speed. So we've actually got a couple of settings we could be adjusting there. So I think this is a good sort of point to feed in a little bit of the logic here. So we have our affectable. And then how I would actually generally sort of structure this is something like this, where we have effect, jump height. And we pass in the original value, and then it will give us back a new value. So what that means is in my affectable, I know one of the functions I'm going to need, original height. This just allows us to make this a little bit more generic, that we can have it that our affectables might add to the existing amount. And this could be applied to multiple different characters. It means we're not having to adjust the effects per character as much. So original height, so that looks good. So we've got a way to affect the height. Now we do have the velocity here, and that's another one where what I would do is affectable, effect, I'm going to actually put underscores before these, jump velocity. So I think that looks a bit of a cleaner API. The APIs do matter for things like this. We do want to make sure we're considering making it easy to avoid confusion and to make it that it's easy to maintain. So original velocity, and then we return the original velocity in this case. So okay, we've patched in the ability for affecting the jump height, jump velocity. We need to make sure those are public. Now there are different ways that we could approach this. We could set up a bunch of interfaces. So we could have things like, okay, the character modem might implement, I jump affectable. But I think this gives us a bit of a cleaner interface. It does mean a very strict coupling between our character motor and the effect system, but I think that's actually okay. I think that's something where the two systems, it does make sense for them to be tied fairly closely together. And I think it's something where, yes, we could try and decouple them more, but there's not really a big advantage for that. We're not talking about something that's particularly heavyweight. These aren't adding a lot of overhead there, so I don't think there's need really to sort of decouple them. I'm also going to, I think fall force could be a good one to also have effectable. So we could do then effects like making the character super heavy. Fall force. Because if a character's super heavy, it would make sense that they fall faster. And they also can't jump as high. So there's different things we could be having set up there. And I'm in particular setting this up so that we can chain these effects together. And that's very much the intent here, is that these effects are something where we can combine multiple of them. Turn original fall force. So that's pretty good. We'll just go back to Unity, make sure it's still happy with us, which it is. So we've got the ability to affect the jump and the fall information, so that's pretty good. So then the character's speed could be a good one to be able to affect as well. So the general movement speed for the character, we actually have, from memory, there is actually a property used for that. So we have a bunch of things there for making sure we're properly grounded. So those are our various step checks and so forth. And then we have the movement speed set up here. So if we're grounded, there we go. So we have our current speed. And that is a property. So this is something where we can look at adjusting this. So we have our run and walk speeds. We also have in-air speed as well. So I'm going to just reorganize this a little bit so it's a little bit clearer of what we're working with. So again, this is something where we could do a setup like this: affectable, affect ground speed. And this one would be affectable, affect air speed, or in-air speed, I think would be a more appropriate term. So ground speed and in-air speed. This will give us a good mix of ones that we can modify, because this is stuff that will really change the effect in terms of how it feels to control the character. And that's sort of the idea, is having a range of ones that it's going to change how the character has to, well, how the player has to actually behave. Now, in terms of potentially being able to invert the input, because that's something where we do already have inversion support. So we have the handling of that, and that happens with the camera input. So we can see here, get camera input, and that gives us back a vector 2. So this could be something where we've got a few different ways of how we could look at affecting this. So I am inclined to say affectable affect camera input, because this, by affecting the entire camera input, that actually means that what we would be able to do is we would be able to not just change inversion, but we could also make it that we skew it in a particular direction. We could invert not just the vertical input, but also the horizontal input. So inverting, so when your player goes to move left, actually moves the camera to the right. So we're going to have another one here, vector 2, affect camera input, vector 2, original camera input. And initially we just pass everything through, And then let's take a final look at for where we get our movement input, because I reckon we should set up a one here for affecting that movement input. Just so that we've then got the ability, we could have an effect that what it does is it makes it as if the character is moving through something really, really solid. So effect, and although we've already got the speed change, I think. So actually we could do that with a speed change. So I don't think we need any more than what we've got. So we have the ability now to change the jump characteristics of the player, to change their speed, so we could speed them up or slow them down, and we can also affect their camera input. So first thing we want to do before we start trying to rig these up having an effect is we want to make sure that in setting all of this up, we haven't broken anything. It's an important thing before we start messing with these. We want to make sure everything still behaves the way that it's supposed to. So we can still look around, we can still move around, can still jump. Everything is behaving the way that it did before, which is good. So that's what we want to make sure is happening. Now we need to start setting up these effects. So let's have a look at, we don't need a character side, we've got a base effect. So I think these effects, a setup that I think makes sense for these is to have these be scriptable objects. And I think then we can set up, so base effect is not one that people need to be able to instantiate, so I'm not going to actually have that have anything that's exposed, but I will give it a serialized field duration, which I'm going to default to 0, so effectively doing nothing. Also going to set up here a virtual void for tick effect. And I'm going to actually, I'll leave it as that. And then I will have a float for duration remaining, which again will start at 0. We'll set up stuff for being able to initiate the effect. So enable effect. So then that will just set the duration remaining, the duration. And I think we could set up a handy little bool here, is active, which that will tell us if the duration remaining is greater than 0. Just as a quick and easy way for us being able to check, is this effect still actually doing something? Because that means then in tick effect, what we can do is duration remaining, well, if duration remaining is greater than 0, duration remaining, and we get rid of a delta time amount of it. Tick the effect. So that's good. I'm actually going to not make these virtual. I don't want the child classes overriding them. So, okay, we'll have that. We've got our effectable object. So I think this is something where we would have a list of base effect, active effects. Here's a new list of base effect. And then we'll have a interface here, apply effect, and we would be provided with that scriptable object for it. So the effect template. Now I'm specifically saying template here because what I want to do is I don't want to be changing anything on that scriptable object. So I want to actually instantiate that effect template and add that into the active effects. So new effect, we instantiate it, we tell it that it's enabled, and then we add that into our active effects list. So we create a new instance. This allows us to have that, if we want to have multiple of the same effect applied, we easily can. The effect, and then make the effect active. Because what that means is here in update, we would go through and index. I'm actually going to start at the end for a very intentional reason that we'll see in a moment. So I'm going to start at the last one, going to loop while index is greater than or equal to 0. And we do a minus minus on the index. I would say active effects, index, and I want to tick it. Then I want to check if that is active. If it's no longer active, then I just want to remove it. So active effects, remove at index. So tick all active effects, clean up any that are finished. So the reason for looping backwards just means that I don't need to do any extra little bits of trickery for the fact that, well, I've updated index 0, but I've then removed the one at index 0. So actually I need to decrease index so that then it updates the next one correctly. So this is just a way of making it a little bit easier. So it means the loop counts down. Which is completely fine. It's a very valid way of setting things up. Very common structure for when we're doing things like this, where we are actually able to be removing an effect. So now, okay, that looks pretty good. So what I'm going to do is these, quite intentionally, I'm going to bring all of these over. Reason being is these actually are a pretty good reference for what we want the interface to be. These are all going to be virtual though, because the different classes that inherit off of this can actually then implement their own logic. So these are all going to be virtual and are going to currently do nothing. So that looks pretty solid. And so with that in mind, we can then set up our logic for how these apply things here actually work. So what we would do is index is equal to 0, index is less than active effects dot count, increment index. So then we would be saying, well, if that active effect index, if that is not active, we want to skip it. Otherwise, we'll apply the effect. So active effects index effect jump height. Now what I would generally do is I would have a setup like this of working height is equal to original, so that then I can be doing this setup. Now, because it's a float, I could just use original height here and I could modify it. But the reason I want to use a working height is just because inevitably we're going to copy and paste this. That's an inevitable thing. We don't necessarily want to be modifying that original, and there are going to be some types that if we change them, it would change the original one. So I think just having that process of creating the working version and then processing based upon that just ensures that if we do copy and paste this in future, that it's not going to be something where we're by default changing the original. So it's just a little bit of defensive programming there for in the future. And you can see the effects will actually chain together. And it applies the effects in the order that they have been added to the effectable. So newer effects get applied last, whereas the older effects get applied first, and they chain together. So if you had multiple things that affect jump height, then they can all layer on top of each other, which is a cool setup. So apply any active effects. And then this we're going to repeat this logic in every single one of these. And this is where me using a different variable name for each one was really quite an intentional thing, because it means the code, even though I'm copying and pasting, the code is going to error, which is good. That's what I want, because it means that it's highlighting things need to be corrected. So first thing I'm going to do is the things that are not triggering errors, just because those are the ones that would be really easy to miss, and it would be quite colorful if we ended up accidentally having it change a different parameter what we intended. So in this case, I just want to change the things that are not currently causing errors first. Then we have some bits like this, where we're working with a vector 2, and in this, working camera input. So we just change these around. So the F2 to rename, super handy. Working in airspeed just makes it a lot quicker and safer for changing things, because it's going to find all of the references to that variable and make sure they're all correctly updated. Working ground speed. So we almost have our full setup for this. We don't have any of the data, but the data is actually a pretty easy part to this. Most of it is down into this infrastructure. So working jump velocity, I can rename that to original jump velocity, just for clarity. So there we go. We've got our logic to apply the effects. Effects have a lifetime. It's pretty good so far. We can actually, I think this is a good point to set up some of those effects. So our base effect is going to provide a pretty good template. What I'm going to do is have an effect. Let's make it that we have a bunch of different, so an effect of supergravity. And we'll be able to use this as a bit of a template. So these will all inherit from base effect. This is called supergravity, and we make sure we've got the proper naming. So we know we don't need duration, any of those bits for it. We don't need tick effect. And we'll be able to pick out the only ones of this that we actually need. So these, we want to be able to actually create these. We need a create asset menu, but that won't autofill until Unity's gone and properly compiled the code. Then we'll be able to have the autocomplete for the create asset menu. Now, these are getting grumpy because it wants these to be override, which is fine. And we will actually delete most of these, because a lot of these we don't need. I just want to get the creating of the asset menu going though. So menu name. So we have effects, supergravity. And then we can set the file name, effect, supergravity. So that's pretty good. Happy with that. I'm going to copy that because we're going to have a couple of other ones. Effect, low gravity, which will end up doing the opposite of the supergravity one. So effect, low gravity. And then a final one for effect, inverted controls, which is going to be one that is going to probably be quite confusing while it has an effect, but applied appropriately in a game can be really effective. Can be a great way to keep players on their toes. inverted controls. So the logic for these is not too complex. I think for my supergravity ones, let's set up a couple of fields here. So we could have jump height modifier, well, supergravity. So we're going to reduce it by 50% of what it was. So we just multiply. Similar thing with jump velocity modifier. Again, I'm going to multiply by 0.5. But our fall force will go way up. Our fall force modifier is 2. See, I might make that 4. Let's make it really high amount here. It won't change the ground or air speed, but we could modify those too. So really simple in terms of what it does. Very straightforward. It'll just scale by those different amounts. Low gravity is actually going to be pretty similar, to the extent that we could combine these as the actual one effect with just different parameters. I want to keep them separate though, just because there might be different things that we are wanting to do for them. Full force, let's really lower that. And then the inverted controls. So this is going to, what I will do is I will take my original camera input, and what I'm going to do is, I will return a new, actually I can just do camera input times by -1. That will scale all the components by -1, so it will flip them, and that should be utterly frustrating to encounter, which is kind of the idea, that we want it to be a really sort of annoying thing intentionally for the player. So I can actually create my assets here then. So effect data. So let's just create a couple of these different effects. I want to create an effect for inverted controls. I can create an effect for low gravity and create an effect for supergravity. And so let's set the duration of these. So low gravity feels like that would be a fun one to have apply for like a while. Same, I think, for the supergravity. Inverted controls, I'm just going to make it 10 seconds because I think that's something where that will probably be really frustrating, but that's okay. So we've got our scriptable objects. Now we need the ability to have these be applied. So what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to just scatter a few spheres around the environment, and these spheres will apply the particular effects. 5, that's 10 and 15. Let's make sure that's not too near the player. So this is going to be invert controls. Then a bit away from that, -5 is going to be low gravity. And then a bit further again is going to be high gravity. So with these, I don't want them to be colliders, I just want them to be triggers. So these are just going to have a simple little script on them to apply the particular effect. So effect trigger. So each of these will just have the effect trigger on them, which what they will do is when the player collides with them, it'll apply that effect to that particular one. So those effect triggers are going to need a link. So there's field, base effect, the effect, and then we should be able to have non-trigger enter, collider other, and let's just do a quick check for if the other has a affectable object script on it. So if it does, so far affectable object. If it doesn't, actually, yeah, if it does, it's not equal to null, then I want to say affectable object, apply effect. So applying the effect, F support. This means it doesn't matter if it's a player or if it's something else, anything that comes through there could be affected by this. So this is an easy way for us being able to just have it be fairly generic. We can link up our data here, so low gravity and high gravity, super gravity one, can rename that super gravity. And let's just quickly set up a couple of materials just for making the things visually stand out. Materials. So we'll just have matte effect, invert controls, and we'll have a low gravity, and super gravity. So invert controls, I'm going to make magenta because it's going to feel like a bug. It's not a bug, but the fact that it's going to suddenly and for a time invert all of the controls is going to feel super weird. The low gravity one, I'm going to make it like a sky blue, I think is nice. And then super gravity, I'm going to make the super gravity one a really sort of dark red. So there we go. So these are linked up. They're set as triggers. Should be the case that as soon as I move through them, we see the particular effects apply. Now, I'm actually going to move these over to here, just so that they're nice and easy to access. So let's find out how this works. So blue was our one for low gravity. So we've run through that. Feels a little bit like we're lighter. Okay, yep, no, we are definitely, and we can see it chaining together. But then if I decide to go through the super gravity one, it's a little bit less. A bit more again. And then I'm back to normal. But as those effects fall off, I will actually see that change. And then if I go through the invert controls, then, oh, okay, let's see if I can manage to go through the invert controls again, which I have, and it's back to the default. And I managed, I think, to jump through the terrain. Let's see where the player, yes. So we might need to, for the player with the collision detection, let's just move that to continuous, seeing as we were messing with the gravity quite a lot for the character there. But what we can see is we've got the ability to chain together these effects. They have a time limit. So at the moment, my controls are inverted, but I know that that control inversion is only going to, and there we go, control inversion is stopped. So we have a timed effect system. Anything moving through that has an affectable object script on it could be affected. So if we had status effects that were healing the player or applying damage, This gives us a generic way of doing this, and this means that what we can do is we can set up a rule set for our game, for example. So if you had something that could apply a fire or a freezing effect, not only could that apply to the player, but say you took an object and you put that in there and it had the effectable object script on it, then okay, well, this, torch that I put in there is now affected by fire, which means it's burning, which means then I can take it and do, different things with it. So it gives us a generic structure that we can use. And so the key stuff with this is we've set up our information in a couple of key ways. So one of the big things is that we have this central script that is on anything that can be affected. And its job is to keep track of what effects are active, to tick them so that they can deactivate when they are done. And its job is also, it's the routing point. It's the thing that other objects in the world ask, okay, how is this thing affected? And then based upon that, it will go through and pass that information to the different effects and let them make those changes. We keep our effects really simple. Our effects have some basic data. They're using scriptable objects so that they are assets that we can create in our project. It makes it easy for us to manage and maintain them, so we can easily work with them like that. And then our actual individual effects, their focus is purely just on making the changes to the data that they need to. So we've tightly coupled our system, so our character motor is tightly coupled to our effects system, which we could decouple it, but it's something where there's no real need for us doing that. So while decoupling systems and making things more modular is generally a good approach, it has to be for good reason. So like the character motor is fairly self-contained, but it does have dependencies on things like my settings system, because that's something where it just is it's stuff where the performance is going to be better with that tighter coupling, and there's not enough of an advantage of use cases of where I'd want to split them apart. So with the effect stuff, dive in and experiment with it. See what other effects you could set up. Like this effect system, it's self-contained. We've got it in this folder here. None of the stuff in this effect system is dependent on anything outside of this folder. So this effect system is something you could then take and put into any project. Could be 2D, 3D, doesn't really matter. It's a generic system that you can extend and add to, and then be able to be using that in any of your projects. So dive in, experiment with it, see what kinds of things you can create, and have fun. Thanks, folks. If you're looking for the code for the project, then in the description below, you'll find a link to the GitHub. And on the GitHub, I've got the code for this project and for all of the other projects. They're freely available. And if you have found the video helpful and you'd like to support the channel, then throwing in a like or subscribing is always a huge help. If you're looking for further ways to support, then I do have a Patreon set up, and that's going to help me keep managing to do these videos for a long time to come, which is going to help more people make cool things. And that's awesome, because that's what this is all about, is helping more people make more cool things. And that is all. Thank you.